So just to let you know, this video deserves the title of the most clickbaity video on YouTube because you can't explain non-duality in simple terms because it is neither simple nor is it complex, and non-duality means not two. So simplicity and complexity are not two things. The other problem arises when we try to explain or to define something. So the more that I've gotten into non-duality, the more I appreciate looking up the etymology of a word rather than the definition. So looking up the definition of a word can give you a whole ton of insights. But etymology kind of does one better, as it shows you how the meaning of the word evolved over time. So a lot of the words that we use, we believe that we understand what they really mean. In reality, we have a whole ton of connotations that are attached to them. And we believe that and act as if the meaning has changed. So when we go back to the origin of the word and we go and we look at word roots and what certain words have in common, and we apply them to this understanding, a whole bunch of hilarious insights and kind of like releases of these connotations and releases of patterns of thinking that we have, habits of thinking we have that plain old don't feel good and don't get us where we want to be going. And we can see these and release them. So when we define, like I say, I like etymology more than just trying to define a word. When we define, let's look up the etymology of define. To specify, to fix or establish authoritatively, late 14th century. From Old French, définir, to finish, conclude, come to an end, bring to an end. From Latin, definire, I don't know how to pronounce these things, so forgive me. To limit, determine, explain. Finir, to bound, to limit. Okay, so define, like drawing a line. Defining a word is saying that this is what it means. This is one thing over another. So when it comes to non-duality, we realize that words don't actually have a definition. And the entire, the solidity of language seems to completely fall apart. So when you have words that have more than one meaning, or you have words that are both like a noun and a verb or an adjective, you see that there really are no separate meanings, in that everything is sort of a verb. Nothing can actually be explained, and that's the end of it, like in the etymology or definition of define, bringing it to an end. We cannot actually bring it to an end. So, explaining non-duality in simple terms, the sort of magic of all of this is that it is so utterly and completely simple that you would write it off as too complex. Or it is so completely and utterly simple that we overlook it. So essentially, you are the awareness, aware of all of the differences in things. And so as that awareness, you are not two. You are the ones who is making those differences, and those differences are appearing as. So our visual field works off contrast of light and dark, light and shadows. So in order for us to see anything, there has to be contrast, and then we have the truly beautiful but simple complexity of colors to make that even more magical. And that's how we define with sight what we are, what something is not. So we are essentially the awareness behind that and not that. So in non-duality, the idea that we are a separate thing and we are defined by our bodies is seen through or seen beyond. So it's not actually a problem. You're not the body, an exclusion of. So another way to define non-duality is saying that there is no exclusion. We can't draw that line and exclude one thing, but we can draw that line for the purpose of creation. So, etymology of simple is going to show you how this magic works. So simple, circa 1200, free from duplicity, upright, guileless, blameless, innocently harmless, and then also goes into the meanings of ignorant, uneducated, unsophisticated. From Latin simplus, from pi compound SMPLO, from root sem, one as one, together with PLO, fold. Okay, so it's one, simplicity is one thing, so it's taking away the numbers and the complexity. However, simplicity and complexity are not two different things. So complex from 1650s, interesting that they had simple much earlier than they had the word complex. Composed of interconnected parts, formed by a combination of simple things or elements. So in order to have complexity, we have to have simplicity. We have to take simple things and put them together. And so a whole nother way to picture this or understand this is at the end of it, which is, this is from Latin complexus, surrounding, encompassing. Okay, so surrounding what? Encompassing what? That awareness is the very center. It's the nothing, the very center. So this is a very complex analogy, but also like insanely simple. So imagine that you have a perfect sphere and you're trying to find the center of it. So you could do that easily. We know where the center of a sphere is. But in order to mark that and like point to it, you would be drawing a point in the center of that sphere, which would essentially be another sphere. So you could never, ever, it would go on infinitely. So everything is infinite, not finite, not two. Non-duality, not two. No exclusion. So the very best way to explain this is by saying no. So when we say exclusion, that's saying no to something. So we're saying no exclusion. You see how the language completely falls apart into hilarity. And there's also, sometimes people think it's complex because what you're doing is you're pushing the mind to the limits. And so you'll reach like a stopping point where it can't continue. And that is sort of like beyond understanding, and that's kind of the magic of the whole thing. So rather than being kind of like discouraged by that, you start to learn to love that kind of thing. So complex comes from complexus, meaning surrounding, and encompassing. Surrounding what? Are there two? Is there the center of the sphere, or is that another sphere forever? And then in transferred use, to hold fast, master, comprehend, from calm, meaning with, together, and plectere, to weave, braid, twine, entwine, from suffix form of root plek to plate. Okay, so like woven, complexity is woven together of simplicity. So the whole idea of simplicity and complexity is a comparison, one with the other. So what's simple to somebody is complex to somebody else. So the whole like desire to explain non-duality simply, it is so simple, it actually like sort of creates this blinding like sense of complexity. Okay, so here is the other magic of it. So duality seems to work upon comparisons. So in order for me to know what something is, I must compare it. Okay, so the same idea as all appearance uses contrast to appear. So white is lighter than black, black is darker than light, and then like if I'm trying to explain the shades of orange, one is brighter than, one is more yellow than, one is darker than. So comparison is sort of what seems to create things. So when we use compare and contrast, which again aren't two different things, and when you look up the definition of them, you realize this. So this is within creation that we compare and contrast, but when we compare ourselves with another and find ourselves lacking, it feels bad. Now, this is a whole nother subject I go into in a lot more of my videos, but one of the huge realizations from non-duality is that feeling responds to our thoughts. So it's a kind of guidance. So when we have thoughts that feel bad, we know that we're causing a kind of separation. We're defining, we're drawing a line, we're excluding ourselves from something in a way that is against like the greater simplicity or not too love of the whole. So compare, it's a funny thing, like the etymology, circa 1400, regard or treat as equal. Early 15th century, liken, make a comparison, represent as similar. And so then later on, it's, you can read this actual thing, I'm not going to read it all out. But so we use compare as how things are different. So this book I discovered accidentally. Mr. God, This Is Anna by Finn. It's, if you want to buy it, you'll have to get a used copy because it's never been reprinted. But I accidentally found this, and it's one of the most brilliant books. It explains non-duality simply and just brilliantly and like with emotion, because the emotion and feeling is not something we can cut out of non-duality. Again, excluding. And so I just happened to like flip this book open last night to this page and read it, and this inspired the entire video. So I highly recommend this. But it's just like to give you some context. So it's written by, and whether it's a true story or not, it's true. Again, non-duality, like nobody really knows. So it's mostly true. So it's what's his name? Finn, I think. So he like finds this little girl on a street. His mother takes him in, and they have this like amazing relationship, and she just questions everything and has this spiritual connection to like life and everything, just like beyond belief. So the setup of this conversation is that she is talking to him about how somebody said that she was big for her age, but she's really tiny. So which is it? So here's the conversation, which this totally explains like the magic of this completely. Well then, if them girls was 10, I would be littler, wouldn't I? Could be. If I was the only one, I wouldn't be littler or bigger, would I? I'd just be me, wouldn't I? I nodded my agreement. I could feel the tide coming in again. I could feel her working up to something, so I tried one last sentence before I was submerged. Look, Tick, you don't use words like bigger or lovelier or smaller or sweeter unless you've got some other thing to compare them with. Then you can't then, not always. There was a note of confidence in her voice. Can't what? I asked. Can't compare, 'cause... And Anna fired her salvo of big guns. 'Cause Mr. God, there ain't two Mr. Gods, so you can't compare. People don't compare Mr. God with themselves. I know, she giggled at my efforts to defend myself. So what are you getting all fuzzed up about then? 'Cause they compare themselves with Mr. God. Same difference, I replied. Ain't. I reckoned I had won this particular exchange, since my questions had forced her into a wrong move. After all, she had agreed that people didn't compare Mr. God with themselves, so it followed that they didn't compare themselves with Mr. God, and I told her so. Preparing to move to the top of the class on this particular exchange, I launched my unsinkable man-of-war with, you said people did compare. You should have said that people didn't compare. Anna looked at me. I hurriedly manned the big guns. I knew that I was right, but I was going to be prepared, just in case. Anna looked, and my unsinkable man-of-war just disappeared. I can remember feeling bad that she had handcuffed herself with her own arguments, feeling bad that it had been to some extent my fault, and feeling bad that I had enjoyed winning this exchange. She moved close to me and put her arms around me, and buried her head in the base of my chest. I thought how tired she must be with all this thinking, how disappointed she must feel because she hadn't got it. All the doors of my storehouse of comfort and love opened wide, and I hugged her. She gave a little wriggle to signify that she understood. Finn, she said quietly, compare 2 with 3. 1 less, I murmured in a fug of contentment. Now compare 3 with 2. 1 more. That's right, 1 less is the same as 1 more. Uh-huh, I grunted. 1 less is the same as, hey! Suddenly she was 10 yards away, doubled up with mirth and hooting like a banshee. It isn't the same, I yelled after her. It is too, she bellowed. And so, identification, saying that we are more than or less than, and not like the awareness of this is what creates the entire idea of comparison, which further gets into the magic, like why you're here. Why do you want to know what non-duality is? Why do you want it explained to you simply? Because when you don't compare things, when it's not just when your happiness isn't just based on improvement, but it just is already. So many things, so many problems that we come up with, so many ways that we cut ourselves off just completely fall away. So last night, after rereading that section in Mr. God, this is Anna, the song Nothing Compares just like hit me. And I realized like the nothing in that song. The song is very sad, it's full of suffering. The hilarious thing is Prince actually wrote it, and so like the song title is Nothing Compares to You. So non-duality. It's very interesting, very funny. So nothing can make you happy. Nothing compares to you. And yet, as I explained, you are the nothing. The nothing is the fullness. It's not two. So nothing compares, as if nothing was an entity that compares. Nothing is the one who compares, and nothing compares. There is no comparison. Like, all of these meanings kind of like come together. They aren't separate meanings. There isn't one meaning inherently intended. And they all sort of like dissolve into no meaning or profound meaning. This stuff is fun. It's some people sometimes go through a stage where they feel a little bit uncomfortable. It sounds a little bit crazy. It sounds a little bit annoying. It sounds a little bit confusing, but really it is so much fun. And you start to listen to people talk, and they're saying something that they're feeling bad about, and you see like within the language where they are believing that a word means a specific thing, and they're trying to resolve it within the realm of language, whereas really what you are is beyond the language. You're the creator of the language. You're the author of the language. So it's the character who can compare itself. It can develop over time, and it does. It can fall short of another character, or it can rise above another character. But the author is completely beyond that. And the author is the only thing that has any reality to the story. And yet, we read stories, and that's sort of the magic of it, and that's sort of the magic of life here on Earth. And when you start to understand your creative power and the love and the creativity and the inspiration behind the writing of the story, it's beyond the exclusion, beyond the individual characters, beyond the comparing. And you can hack your happiness if you think about getting something in particular. So if you give somebody who doesn't have enough to eat food, that makes them very, very happy. However, if you give somebody who has plenty of food and plenty of money to buy food, if you give them food, it may, if it's something that they're interested in eating, make them slightly happy. The misunderstanding is that the object, that the reception of it causes the happiness. So this is sort of like a false happiness, or a false like identification when it comes to looking at another person, comparing ourselves with them, and finding ourselves either better than or falling short of. So depending on where we stand, and in etymology, the root sta or stand is a very important thing. So standing, defining, pointing to where it is, pointing to that center of the sphere, and saying exactly where it is. In order for there to be movement, there must be standing still. Everything is created with duality. And so what happens is when we receive something, we think that the happiness is in the circumstance of seeing ourselves as better than, or in receiving something that we hadn't had before, when in reality, we're beyond that. So, thoughts that are truly exclusionary don't feel good, because that's not actually what's going on here. And the emotions and the feelings in the body is not separate from emotions. Emotions are not separate from thoughts. They're not two separate things. Only when we're talking about them are they two things. So the emotions tell us when we are believing something, when we're believing some connotation, when we're believing some definition that cuts ourselves off. So it's not actually the circumstance, it's the way we're seeing things. So in order, non-duality, so I might be pushing this a little too far, but it's fun. It really is fun. If it's not fun, stop and come back to it later. So seeing and being blind. In order to see something, you must be blind to another thing. You have a blind spot right in the center of your vision. You don't see that. Why? Because you can't see a blind spot. So when it comes to letting go of these beliefs and these ways that we're cutting ourselves off, we cannot see the blind spot. So it's when we stop trying to see it as a particular thing in exclusion of other things, but go in the direction of feeling and start to see the beauty and start to see the inspiration and start to live as the author, creating and enjoying. The author and the reader who loves the book are the very same. They're not two. When we start to really enjoy this, it's then, from the author's standpoint, there is no author. Like, there's no center of the sphere. It's then when the revelations occur. Revelations is in you revel in it. It feels amazing. And it's the information, it's the truth, so to speak, the truth, not an exclusion than anything else. And so when we let go of it is true that it is better to be better than these other people, when we let go of those truths, then the real truth floods in. It's like the what do you call them, like levees, like when you have a flood to keep the flood back, or like a dam, like building a dam. It's like when that's taken away, it just floods in those barriers, that love, that inspiration, that power beyond power or weakness or humility that we truly are. That floods in.